Happy Thor's Day, friends. Robert, son of Irvin, here once again at Smith County Public Library for another installment of Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. And tonight, our theme is fishing. One is an actual fishing trip. Another one is fishing for the right fish in the sea, the right woman. And we begin our slow descent to the twilight of the gods, Ragnarok. We've been looking for it since we've been here, and it's been hinted upon. Now we're getting to, begin to get the chapters that actually discuss Ragnarok. The story of Gerd and Frey. Frey, the brother of Freya, was the mightiest of the Vanir. He was handsome and noble, a warrior and a lover, but he was missing something in his life, and he didn't know what that was. The mortals of Midgard revered Frey. He made the seasons, they said. Frey made the fields fertile and brought forth life from the dead ground. The people worshipped Frey, and they loved him, but this did not fill the empty place inside of him. Frey took stock of his possessions. He had a sword so powerful and remarkable that it fought by itself, but this didn't satisfy Frey. He had Gullinbursti, the boar with the golden bristles, created by the dwarf Brock and his brother Atri. Gullinbursti pulled Frey's chariot. It could run through the air and over the water, run faster than any horse, and run even in the darkest night, for its golden bristles shone so brightly. But Gullinbursti didn't satisfy Frey. He had Skidbladnir, a boat made for him by the three dwarfs known as the Sons of Ivaldi. It wasn't the biggest ship there was. That was Nogfar, the death ship, made from the untrimmed fingernails of the dead. But there was room for all the Aesir on board. When the sails of Skidbladnir were set, the winds were always fair, and it took you wherever you needed to go. Even though it was the second biggest ship there had ever been and would hold all the Aesir, Frey could fold Skidbladnir up like a cloth and place it in his bag. It was the best of all ships. But Skidbladnir did not satisfy him. He owned the finest residence that was not Asgard. It was Alfheim, the home of the Light Elves, where he was always welcomed and acknowledged as overlord. There was nowhere like Alfheim, and yet it didn't satisfy him. Frey's servant, Skirnir, was one of the Light Elves. He was the finest of servants, wise of counsel, and fair of face. Frey ordered Skirnir to harness Gullinbursti, and they set out for Asgard together. When they reached Asgard, they walked toward Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. In Odin's Valhalla live the Einherjar, those who fight alone, all the men who have died nobly in battles at the beginning of time. Their souls are taken from the battlefields by Valkyries, the warrior women charged by Odin with the task of bringing the souls of the noble dead, battle slain, to their ultimate reward. There must be a lot of them, said Skirnir, who had not been there before. There are, Frey told him, but there are more to come, and more will still be needed when we fight the wolf. They heard the sound of battle as they approached the fields around Valhalla. They heard the clash of metal on metal, the thud of metal on flesh. As they watched, they saw powerful warriors of all ages and places, well-matched in battle, dressed in their war gear, each man fighting his hardest. Soon enough, half the men were lying dead on the grass. Enough, called a voice. The battle's over for today. At this, those who were still standing helped the dead men get up from the courtyard floor. Their wounds healed as Frey and Skirnir watched, and they clambered onto their horses. All the soldiers who had fought that day, whether they had won or lost, rode home to Valhalla, the hall of the noble dead. Valhalla was an enormous hall. It had 540 doors, and each door allowed 800 warriors to walk abreast. It seated more people than the mind could hold. In the hall, the warriors cheered as the feast began. They were eating boar meat, ladled out from an enormous cauldron. This was the meat of the boar Saramir. Every night they would feast upon the boar's meat, and each morning the monstrous beast would be alive again, ready to be slain later that day and to give its life and its flesh to feed the noble dead. No matter how many of them were, there would always be enough meat. Mead was brought for them to drink. So much mead for so many warriors, said Skirnir. Where does it come from? It comes from a goat called Hadrin, Frey told him. She stands on top of Valhalla and eats the leaves of the tree called Lirad, which is what we call that branch of Yggdrasil, the world tree. From her udders the finest mead flows. There will always be enough for every warrior. They walked to the high table where Odin sat. He had a bowl of meat in front of him, but he didn't taste it. He would stab a piece of meat with his knife from time to time and flick it to the ground, to be eaten by one of his wolves, Gary and Freaky. 2 ravens sat on Odin's shoulders, and he would give the ravens scraps of meat as well, while they whispered to him of things that were happening far away. "He's not eating," whispered Skirnir. "He doesn't need to," said Frey. "He drinks. He only needs wine, nothing else. Come on, we're done here." "Why were we here?" asked Skirnir as they walked out of one of the 540 doors of Valhalla. "Because I wanted to make sure that Odin was here in Valhalla with the warriors and not in his own hall at the Lidskjalf, the observation point." They entered Odin's hall. "Wait here," said Frey. Frey walked alone into Odin's hall and clambered up onto the throne from which Odin could see everything that happened across the 9 worlds. Frey looked out across the worlds. He looked to the south, to the east, and to the west, and he did not see the thing he was looking for. And then he looked to the north and saw the thing he was missing in his life. Skirnir was waiting by the door when his master came from the hall. There was an expression on Frey's face Skirnir had never seen before, and Skirnir was afraid, but left the place without speaking. Frey drove the chariot pulled by Gullinbursti back to his father's hall. Frey spoke to nobody when they got there, neither his father Njord, who was the master of all who sail the seas, nor his stepmother Skadi, the lady of the mountains. He went to his room with a face as dark as midnight, and there he stayed. On the 3rd day, Njord sent for Skirnir. "Frey's been here for 3 days and 3 nights, Njord said. "He hasn't eaten, nor has he drunk anything." "This is true," said Skirnir. "What have we done to anger him so?" asked Njord. "My son, who is always so gentle and filled with kind, wise words, now says nothing, only looks at us with fury. What did we do to upset him?" "I do not know," said Skirnir. "Then," said Njord, "you must go to him and ask him what's happening. Ask him why he is so angry he will not speak to any of us." "I'd rather not," said Skirnir, "but I cannot refuse you, Lord. He is such a strange, dark mood. I'm afraid of what he'll do if I ask him." "Ask him," said Njord, "and do what you can for him. He is your master." Skirnir of the Light Elves went to where Frey stood looking out at the sea. Frey's face was clouded and troubled, and Skirnir hesitated to approach him. "Frey," said Skirnir. Frey said nothing. "Frey, what has happened? You're angry. Or are you downcast? Something has happened. You have to tell me what's happening to you." "I'm being punished," said Frey, and his voice sounded hollow and distant. "I went to the All-Father's holy seat, and I looked out at the world. For my arrogance in believing I had a right to this observation place, my happiness has been taken from me forever. I have paid for my crime, and I'm paying still." "My lord," said Skirnir, "what did you see?" Frey was silent, and Skirnir thought he had once again sunk into a troubled silence. But after some time he said, "I looked to the north. I saw a dwelling there, a splendid house, and I saw a woman walking up to the house. I had never seen a woman like her. Nobody who looks like her, no one who moves like her. As she raised her arms to unlock the door to her house, the light glanced off her arms, and it seemed to illuminate the air and to brighten the sea, and because she is in it, the whole world is a brighter, more beautiful place. And then I looked away, and I saw her no more, and my world became dark and hopeless and empty." "Who is she?" asked Skirnir. "A giant. Her father is Hymir, the earth giant. Her mother, a mountain giant, Arboda." "And does this beautiful creature have a name?" "Her name is Gerd." Frey was silent once more. Skirnir said, "Your father is worried about you. We're all worried. Is there something I can do?" "If you'll go to her and ask for her hand, I would give anything. I can't live without her. Bring her back to me, to be my wife, whatever her father says. I will pay you so well." "You're asking a lot, my lord," said Skirnir. "I will give anything," said Frey fervently, and he shivered. Skirnir nodded. "I will do this thing, lord." He hesitated. "Frey, may I look at your sword?" Frey took out his sword and held it out for Skirnir to examine. "There's no other sword like this. It'll fight by itself without a hand holding it. It will always protect you. No other sword, no matter how powerful, can penetrate its defense. They say this sword could even prevail against the flaming sword of Surtur the fire demon." Skirnir shrugged. "It is a fine sword. If you wish me to bring you Gerd, this sword will be my wages." Frey nodded assent. He gave Skirnir his sword and a horse to ride. Skirnir traveled north until he reached the house of Hymir. He entered as a guest and explained who he was and who had sent him. He told the beautiful Gerd of his master Frey. "He is the most splendid of all the gods," he told her. "He has dominion over the rain and the weather and the sunshine, and he gives the folk of Midgard good harvests and peaceful days and nights. He watches over the prosperity and abundance of humanity. All people love and worship him." He told Gerd of the beauty of Frey and of his power. He told her of the wisdom of Frey, and at the last he told her of the love Frey bore for her, how he had been heart-struck by a vision of her and now would no longer eat or sleep, drink, or speak until she agreed to be his bride. Gerd smiled, and her eyes shone with joy. "Tell him yes," she said. "I will meet him on the Isle Bari for the wedding, 9 days from now. Go, tell him." Skirnir returned to Njord's hall. Before he could even climb down from his horse, Frey was there, even more pale and even more wan than he'd left him. "What news?" he asked. "Do I rejoice or do I despair?" "She will take you to be your husband 9 days from now on the island of Bari," said Skirnir. Frey looked at his servant without joy. "The nights without her in my life last forever," he said. "One night is so long, 2 nights even longer. How will I manage to cope with 3 nights? 4 days feel like a month to me, and you expect me to wait 9 days? And Skirnir looked at his lord with pity. 9 days from that day, on the Isle of Bari, Frey and Gerd met for the first time, and they married in a field of waving barley. She was as beautiful as he'd dreamed, and her touch was as fine, her kiss as sweet as he'd hoped. Their wedding was blessed, and some say that their son Fjolnir went on to become the first king of Sweden. He would drown in a vat of mead late one night, hunting in the darkness for a place to use the bathroom. Skirnir took the sword he'd been given, Frey's sword that fought all by itself, and he returned to Alfheim with it. The beautiful Gerd filled the hole in Frey's life and the hole in his heart. Frey didn't miss his sword, and he didn't replace it. When he fought the giant Beli, he killed him with a stag's antler. Frey was so strong he could kill a giant with his bare hands. Even so, he should not give him the sword away. Ragnarok is coming. When the sky splits asunder and the dark powers of Muspel march out onto the war journey, Frey will wish he still had that sword. Hymir and Thor's fishing expedition. The gods arrived at Aegir's huge hall at the edge of the sea. "We're here," called Thor, who was at the head of the company. "Make a feast for us." Aegir was the greatest of the sea giants. His wife was Ran, whose net those who drown at sea are gathered. His 9 daughters are the waves of the sea. Aegir had no desire to feed the gods, but he also had no wish to fight them. He looked Thor in the eye and said, "I'll make you a banquet, and it'll be the finest feast any of you will have ever attended. My servant, Fimafang, will search each of you diligently, bringing you as much food as your bellies can hold, as much ale as you can drink. I have only one condition. I will throw the feast, but you must first bring me a cauldron big enough to brew ale for your all. There are so many of you, and your appetites are huge." Aegir knew well that the gods had no such cauldron, and without the cauldron he didn't have to give the feast. Thor asked the other gods for advice, but each god he asked was of the opinion that such a cauldron didn't exist. Finally, he asked Tyr, god of battle, god of war. Tyr scratched his chin with his left hand, which was his only hand. "On the edge of the world sea," he said, "lives the giant king Hymir. He owns a cauldron 3 miles deep. It's the biggest cauldron there's ever been." "Can you be sure?" asked Thor. Tyr nodded. "Hymir is my stepfather. He's married to my mother," he said. "She's a giant. I have seen the great cauldron with my own eyes, and as my mother's son I'll be welcome in Hymir's hall." Tyr and Thor climbed into Thor's chariot pulled by the goats Snarler and Grinder, and swiftly they traveled to Hymir's enormous fortress. Thor tied the goats to a tree, and the two made their way inside. There was a giantess in the kitchen, cutting up onions as big as boulders and cabbages the size of boats. Thor couldn't help staring. The old woman had 900 heads, each head uglier and more terrifying than the last. He took a step backward. If Tyr was disturbed, he didn't show it. Tyr called out, "Greetings, grandmother. We're here to see if we can borrow Hymir's cauldron to brew our beer." "Such tiny things, I thought you were mice," said Tyr's grandmother, and when she spoke it sounded like a crowd of people shouting. "You don't want to talk to me, grandson. You should talk to your mother." She called out, "We have guests. Your son is here with a friend," and in moments another giantess walked in. This was Hymir's wife, Tyr's mother. She was dressed in golden cloth, and she was as beautiful as her mother-in-law was alarming. She carried 2 of the tiniest giant thimbles, which she had filled with beer. Thor and Tyr gripped the thimbles, which were the size of buckets, and they drank the beer with enthusiasm. It was excellent beer. The giantess asked Thor his name. Thor was about to tell her, but before he could speak, Tyr said, "His name is Vior, mother. He's my friend, and an enemy of the enemies of Hymir and the giants." They heard a distant rumbling like thunder on the peaks, or mountains crumbling, or huge waves crushing to shore, and the earth shook with each rumble. "My husband's coming home," said the giantess. "I hear his gentle footsteps in the distance." The rumbling became more distinct and seemed to be coming rapidly closer. "My husband is often mad-tempered when he gets home, wrathful and grim of mind. He treats his guests badly," the giantess warned them. "Why don't you get under that kettle and stay there until he's cheerful enough for you to come out?" She hid them beneath a kettle on the floor of the kitchen. It was dark under there. The ground shook, a door slammed, and Thor and Tyr knew that Hymir must be home. They heard the giantess tell her husband that they had guests, her son and a friend, and that he had to be on his best behavior as a gracious host and not kill them. "Why?" The giant's voice was loud and petulant. "The little one's our son Tyr. You remember him. The big one's name is Vior. He's nice to him." Thor's our enemy. Thor, who's killed more giants than anyone else, even other giants. Thor, whom I've sworn to slay if I ever encounter him. Thor the..." "Vior," said his wife, calming him down. "Not Thor. Vior. He's our son's friend, and an enemy of your enemies, so you have to be nice to him." "I am grim of mind and wrathful of spirit, and I have no desire to be nice to anyone," said a huge, lumbering giant voice. "Where are they hiding?" "Oh, just behind that beam over there," said his wife. Thor and Tyr heard a crash as the beam she had pointed to was smashed and broken. This was followed by another series of crashes, as one after another all the kettles in the kitchen were knocked down from the ceiling and destroyed. "Are you finished breaking things?" asked Tyr's mother. "I suppose so," said Hymir's voice grudgingly. "Then look under that kettle," she said, "the one on the floor you didn't destroy." The kettle beneath which Tyr and Thor were hidden was lifted, and they found themselves staring up at an enormous face. Its features twisted to a sulky scowl. This, Thor knew, was Hymir, the giant king. His beard was like a forest of ice-covered trees in midwinter. His eyebrows were like a field of thistles. His breath as rank and foul as a midden in a bog. "Hello, Tyr," said Hymir, without enthusiasm. "Hello, father," said Tyr, with, if possible, even less pleasure. "You'll join us as guests for dinner," said Hymir. He clapped his hands. The door of the hall opened, and a giant ox was led in, its coat shining, its eyes bright, its horns sharp. It was followed by another, even more beautiful, and then the last ox, even finer than the first two. "These are the most excellent oxen in existence, so much bigger and fatter than the beasts of Midgard or Asgard I am," Hymir confided, "enormously proud of my herd of cattle. They're my treasures and the delight of my eyes. I treat them like my own children," and for a moment his scowling face seemed to soften. The grandmother with 900 heads killed each ox, skinned it, and tossed it into her enormous cooking pot. The pot boiled and bubbled over a fire which hissed and spat, and she stirred it with a spoon as big as an oak tree. She sang quietly to herself as she cooked, in a voice like 1,000 old women, all singing at the tops of their voices at once. Soon enough, the food was ready. "Your guests here. Do not stand on ceremony. Take as much as you can eat from the pot," said Hymir expansively. The strangers were small, after all. How much could they eat? After all, the oxen were enormous. Thor said he didn't mind if he did, and he proceeded to devour 2 of the oxen all by himself, one after the other, leaving nothing but clean-picked bones. Then he belched in a satisfied way. "That's a lot of food, Vior," said Hymir. "It was to feed us for several days. I do not think I've ever seen even a giant eat 2 of my oxen at once before." "I was hungry," said Thor, "and I got a little carried away. Look, tomorrow, why don't we go out fishing? I hear you're quite the fisherman." Hymir prided himself on his skills at fishing. "I'm an excellent fisherman," he said. "We can catch tomorrow night's dinner." "I too am a fine fisherman," said Thor. He had never fished before, but how hard could it be? "We'll meet tomorrow at dawn out on the docks," said Hymir. In their huge bedroom that night, Tyr said to Thor, "I hope you know what you're doing." "Of course I do," said Thor, but he didn't. He was just doing whatever he felt like doing. That's what Thor did best. In the gray light before dawn, Thor met Hymir on the dock. "I should warn you, little Vior," said the giant, "that we will be going far out into the icy waters. I row farther out into the cold and stay out longer than a tiny thing like you can survive. Icicles will form on your beard and your hair, and you'll turn blue with cold. You'll probably die." Don't worry me," said Thor. "I like the cold. It's bracing. What are we using for bait?" "I already have my own bait," said Hymir. You got to find your own. You could look in the field of the oxen for it. Nice big maggots in the ox dung, after all. Bring whatever you want from there." Thor looked at Hymir. He thought about hitting Hymir with his hammer, but then he would never get the cauldron, not without a fight. He walked back up the shore. In the meadow was Hymir's herd of beautiful oxen. There were giant patties of dung on the ground with huge maggots writhing and burrowing in them, but Thor avoided all of them. Instead, he walked over to the biggest, most majestic, fattest of the beasts, raised his fist and thumped it between the eyes, killing it instantly. Thor ripped off the beast's head, placed it in his sack, and carried it down to the sea. Hymir was in the boat. He had already cast off and was rowing out of the bay. Thor jumped into the cold water and swam out, hauling his sack behind him. He grabbed the back of the boat with numb fingers, then hauled himself on board, dripping with seawater, ice crusting his red beard. Ah, said Thor, that was fun. Nothing to wake you up on a cold morning like a good swim. Hymir said nothing. Thor took the other set of oars, and they began to row together. Soon enough, the land was gone, and they were alone on the waters of the northern sea. The ocean was gray, the waves were choppy and high, and the wind and the seagulls screamed. Hymir stopped rowing. We'll fish here, he said. Here, asked Thor, where he had hardly gone out into the sea at all, and he picked up the oars and began single-handedly to row them into deeper waters. The boat flew across the waves. Stop, boomed Hymir. These waters are dangerous. This is where Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, is found. Thor stopped rowing. Hymir took 2 large fish from the bottom of the boat. He gutted them with his sharp bait knife, tossed the guts into the sea, then impaled the fish on the hooks of his line. Hymir dropped his baited fishing line. He waited until the line jerked and twitched in his hand, then he hauled up the line. 2 monstrous whales hung from it, the hugest whales Thor had ever seen. Hymir grinned with pride. Not bad, said Thor. He pulled the head of the ox from his sack. When Hymir saw the dead eyes of his favorite ox, his face froze. I got bait, said Thor helpfully, from the ox field, like you said. Expressions of shock, of horror, and of anger chased each other across Hymir's huge face, but he said nothing. Thor took Hymir's fishing line, rammed the ox's head onto the hook, and threw the line and the head into the ocean. He felt it sink to the bottom. He waited. Fishing, he said to Hymir, I suppose it must all be about learning patience. It's a bit dull, isn't it? I wonder what I'm going to catch for your dinner. And that was when the sea erupted. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, had bitten down on the huge ox head, and the hook had dug deep into the roof of its mouth. The serpent writhed in the water, trying to free itself. Thor held onto the line. It's going to drag us under, boomed Hymir in horror. Let go of the line. Thor shook his head. He strained against the fishing line, determined to hold on. The thunder god slammed his feet through the bottom of the boat, and he used the sea bottom to brace himself, and he began to haul Jormungandr up on board. The serpent spat gouts of black poison toward them. Thor ducked, and the poison missed him. He continued to pull. It's the Midgard serpent, you fool, shouted Hymir. Let go of the line. We'll both die. Thor said nothing, just hauled the line in, hand over hand, his eyes fixed on his enemy. I'll kill you, he whispered to the serpent, beneath the roar of the waves and the howl of the wind and the thrashing and screaming of the beast. Or you'll kill me. This I swear. He said it beneath his breath, but he could have sworn the Midgard serpent heard him. It fixed him with his eyes, and the next gout of poison came so close to Thor that he could taste it in the ocean air. The poison sprayed his shoulder, and it burned where it touched. Thor simply laughed and hauled again. Somewhere, it seemed to Thor in the distance, Hymir was babbling and grumbling and shouting about the monstrous serpent, and about the sea rushing into the rowing boat through the holes in the bottom, and about how they would both die out here in the cold, cold ocean. So far from dry land. Thor didn't care about any of this. He was fighting the serpent, playing it, letting it exhaust himself, thrashing and pulling. Thor began to pull the fishing line back into the boat. The Midgard serpent's head was almost within striking distance. Thor reached down without glancing away, and his fingers closed around the haft of his hammer. He knew just where the head of the hammer would need to strike to kill the serpent. One more heave on the fishing line. Hymir's bait knife flashed, and the line was cut. Jormungandr, the serpent, reared up high over the boat and tumbled back into the sea. Thor threw his hammer at it, but the monster was already gone, vanished into the cold, gray waters. The hammer returned, and Thor caught it. He turned his attention back to the sinking fishing boat. Hymir was desperately bailing the water from the bottom. Hymir bailed the water, and Thor rowed the boat back to shore. The 2 whales Hymir had caught earlier at the prow of the boat made the rowing harder than it would normally have been. There's the shore, gasped Hymir, but my home is still many miles away. We could make land here, said Thor. Only if you're willing to carry the boat and me and the 2 whales I caught all the way to my hall, said Hymir, exhausted. Okay. Thor jumped over the side of the fishing boat. A few moments later, Hymir felt the boat rising into the air. Thor was carrying them on his back. Boat, oars, Hymir, and whales, carrying them along the shingle at the edge of the sea. When they reached Hymir's hall, Thor lowered the boat to the ground. There, said Thor, I brought you home as you requested. Now I need a favor from you in return. What? Asked Hymir. Your cauldron, the huge one you brew beer in, I want to borrow that. Hymir said, You're a mighty fisherman and you row hard, but you're asking for the finest brewing kettle in existence. The beer that is magically brewed in it is the best of beers. I'll only lend it to someone who can break the cup I drink from. That doesn't sound very hard, said Thor. They ate roast whale meat for dinner that night in a hall filled with many-headed giants, all of them shouting and happy and most of them drunk. After they had eaten, Hymir drained the last of the beer from his drinking cup and called for silence. Then he handed the cup to Thor. "Smash it," he said. "Smash this cup, and the cauldron in which I brew my beer is yours as my gift to you. Fail, and you die." Thor nodded. The giants stopped their joking and their songs, and they watched him warily. Hymir's fortress was built of stone. Thor took the drinking cup, hefted it in both hands, and then threw it with all his might against one of the granite pillars that held up the roof of the banqueting hall. There was an ear-splitting crash, and the air was filled with blinding dust. When the dust settled, Hymir got up and walked over to what was left of the granite pillar. The cup had gone through first one pillar, then another, breaking them into tiny fragments of stone. In the rubble of the third pillar was the drinking cup, a little dusty, but quite undamaged. Hymir held his drinking cup over his head, and the giants cheered and laughed and made faces at Thor with all their heads, along with crude gestures. Hymir sat down at the table once more. "See," he said to Thor, "I didn't think you were strong enough to break my cup." He held up the cup, and his wife poured beer into it. Hymir slurped the beer. "Best beer you'll ever taste," he said. "Here, wife, pour more beer for your son and for his friend Vior. Let them taste the best beer there is and be sad that they won't be taking my cauldron home with them, and that they'll never again taste beer this good. Also, they'll be sad that I need to kill Vior now, for my cup remains unbroken." Thor sat at the table beside Tyr and picked up a lump of charred whale meat and chewed it resentfully. The giants were raucous and loud and were now ignoring him. Tyr's mother leaned over to fill Thor's cup with beer. "You know," she said quietly, "my husband has a very hard head. He's stubborn and thick-skulled." "They say the same about me," said Thor. "No," she said, as if she was talking to a small child. "He has a very hard head, hard enough to break even the toughest of cups." Thor drained his beer. It really was the best beer he'd ever tasted. He stood up and walked over to Hymir. "Can I try again?" he asked. The giants in the hall all laughed at this, and none of them laughed louder than Hymir. "Of course you can," he said. Thor picked up the drinking cup. He faced the stone wall, hefted the cup up twice, then turned swiftly on his heel and smashed the cup down on Hymir's forehead. The fragments of the cup fell one by one onto Hymir's lap. There was silence in the hall then, a silence broken by a strange heaving noise. Thor looked around to see what the noise was, and then he turned back and he saw Hymir's shoulders shaking. The giant was crying in huge heaving sobs. "My greatest treasure is no longer mine," said Hymir. "I could always tell it to brew me ale, and the cauldron itself would magically brew the finest beer. Never again will I say, 'Brew my ale, my cauldron.'" Thor said nothing. Hymir looked at Tyr and said bitterly, "If you want it, stepson, then take it. It's huge and heavy. It takes over a dozen giants to lift it. Do you think you're strong enough?" Tyr walked over to the cauldron. He tried to lift it once, twice, but it was too heavy even for him. He looked at Thor. Thor shrugged, grasped the cauldron by the rim, and flipped it so he was inside it and the handles clattered at his feet. Then the cauldron began to move with Thor inside. He headed toward the door, while all around the hall many-headed giants stared open-mouthed. Hymir no longer wept. Tyr glanced up at him. "Thank you for the cauldron," he said, and then, keeping the moving cauldron between himself and Hymir, Tyr edged out of the room. Thor and Tyr left the castle together, untethered Thor's goats, and climbed into Thor's chariot. Thor still carried the cauldron on his back. The goats ran as best as they could, but while Snarler ran well and ran fast, even with the weight of the giant's cauldron to pull, Grinder limped and staggered. Its leg had once been broken for marrow, and Thor had said it, but the goat had never been as strong again. Grinder bleated in pain as it ran. "Can't we go any faster?" asked Tyr. "We can try," said Thor, and he whipped the goats so that they ran even faster. Tyr looked behind. "They're coming," he said. "The giants are coming." They were indeed coming, with Hymir at their rear urging them on, all the giants of that part of the world, a many-headed, monstrous bunch, the giants of the waste, misshapen and deadly. An army of giants, all intent on getting their cauldron back. "Go faster," said Tyr. It was then that the goat called Grinder stumbled and fell, throwing them out of the chariot. Thor staggered to his feet, then he threw the cauldron to the ground and began to laugh. "What are you laughing about?" asked Tyr. "There's hundreds of them." Thor hefted Mjolnir, his hammer. "I didn't catch and kill the serpent," he said. "Not this time, but 100 giants almost make up for it." Methodically, enthusiastically, one after the next, Thor killed the giants of the waste until the earth ran black and red with their blood. Tyr fought one-handed, but he fought bravely, and he slew his share of giants as well. When they were done, and all the giants were dead, Thor crouched beside Grinder, his injured goat, and helped it back to its feet. The goat limped as it walked, and Thor cursed Loki, whose fault it was that the goat was lame. Hymir was not among the slain, and Tyr was relieved, for he didn't want to bring his mother any additional distress. Thor carried the cauldron to Asgard to the meeting of the gods. They took the cauldron to Aegir. "Here," said Thor, "a brewing cauldron big enough for all of us." The sea giant sighed. "It is indeed what I asked for," he said. "Very well, there will be an autumn feast for all the gods in my hall." He was as good as his word, and since then, every year once the harvest is in, the gods drink the finest ale there ever was or ever will be in the autumn in the sea giant's hall. And that's our fishing tales for this evening. And our next installment, we read of the death of Balder, where everything starts falling into place for Ragnarok. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you then.